Sell the Thank you. The students who are doing the subject knowledge, traditions, practices of India, the class 11 students and the teachers. And I also welcome all the English teachers who have gathered here to understand how what the glory of our Indian literature. And we are here to get into the facts. And before we commence our program, we have Gauri from Chinmaya Vidyalaya Narva Mode presenting a prayer here. So can we have the recording played? Priyanka.
पद्मपत्रविशालाक्षी पद्मकेसरवर्णिनी नित्यं पद्मालया देवी सा मां पातु सरस्वती वन्दे सरस्वती भुवनत्रयमादरम् यत्प्रसादादृते नित्यं जिह्वान परिवर्तते जिह्वान परिवर्तते.
Thank you. Thank you to Chinmaya Vidyalaya Narva Mode and to Gauri for this beautiful setting the new mood for today's program. So once again, Hari Om to all of you and extend a warm welcome to all of you. Wherever possible, please have your videos on and audios muted. And when you are asked to talk, when you are asked to give some views or comments, please do unmute and speak. And we have today's session is going to be on Indian literature, which is in the class 11 syllabus of the KTPI. We have an expert here, Sri Naresh Keerthi ji. Let's put our hands together and welcome Naresh ji for this wonderful program that we have here is a knowledge sessions we've been having. And he is the head of the Department of Sanskrit at the Ashoka University. And he is our own person because he has earlier served at the Chinmaya Vishwavidyapeeth at Cochin and also at the Hebrew University at Jerusalem. He has been doing a lot of research about the deep enmesh between the literacy cultures of India. In this hand, he studied the Kavya and Nataka scriptures and their commentaries in Sanskrit, Prakrit, and in South Indian languages, Sanskrit and South Indian languages. He's also working on a critical edition of the dramaturgical texts such as Natan Kusum and the Bhava Viveka. And he's interested in the larger questions about the place of the classical literature and the humanities in general in contemporary life and society. And he's a renowned speaker who's conducting a lot of sessions. And here we have Keerthi ji. Keerthi ji, thank you so much for taking your time and being with us this morning to enlighten our students. Over to you, Naresh ji. Thank you.
Thanks. So good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure. I'm very glad to speak to you about a topic that's close to my heart, which is the pre-modern Indian literatures. And as you can see in my title slide, I've called it the literatures of India because it's not really a single monolith. And what we have to kind of take a look at and kind of get a flavor of is a very large period of time and a very great variety of different kinds of literatures, all of which weren't necessarily written down on stone or on palm leaf or on paper. And this is the kind of impressive task that we've set ourselves. And well, in the 1 hour of time that we have, we'll not try and swallow the ocean. Instead, we'll try and sample little bits from here and there. So let's begin by stepping back a moment and looking at this whole schema under which you're studying or listening to these materials. There's a term that's bandied about a lot, and it's called the Indian knowledge systems. I'm sure you've heard these things repeated from time to time. So it's worth spending a few minutes kind of unpacking this for ourselves. what is Indian about it, and what do we mean when we say India here? Do we mean modern India? Do we mean the boundaries of, like, political boundaries of what is modern India? Or do we mean all of those different things that were in circulation and in contact in pre-modern times, say before the 17th or the 18th century? And what do we mean when we say knowledge? So if I have an intimate familiarity with the Asterix or the Tintin comic series, would you say that's knowledge? I'm very knowledgeable about that. So would that qualify as knowledge? And then what is a knowledge system? What does this? Because there's a new term. This is we're only hearing this term now for the last, say, 15 years. So we have to spend some time quickly figuring out for ourselves and getting a satisfactory account of what is Indian, what is knowledge, and then what is the knowledge system. So, well, I think we have fairly simple and interesting answers for this. So when we are speaking about the remit, the scope of the Indian knowledge systems, it's first of all not just the modern political boundaries of India, but everywhere that material from India traveled. And also all of those places from where ideas flowed into India. So we are speaking about not just the subcontinent, not just India, but a larger ecosystem where there was an exchange of stories, there was an exchange of ideas, and so on. What you see on the left side is a kind of a linguistic map of India, where there are, a couple of hundred major languages, and what is not even represented here are over 1,500 dialects of all of these languages, each of which they are of differing antiquity, they are of different periods, they all have stories and poems and plays and riddles, and all of this counts as literature. And all of this qualifies as kavya. And this is a term you're going to hear me use frequently. So kavya, we are going to treat as a kind of capacious term to capture everything that is literature. Now, I was telling you about how these stories, they travel much more successfully than people or even artifacts like books. A book can be burnt, a book can be lost, a book can be torn. But the stories in them, as long as they are circulating, they are in people's memories, they are being retold in gatherings, in courts, in parties, when people are putting their kids to sleep. These stories have a different way of circulating. They have a different specific gravity, one could say. And a star example of this is the text that we know by the name Panchatantra. I'm sure you've all heard a couple of Panchatantra stories. And amongst the many stories of the world, the Panchatantra would qualify as a frequent flyer. We find already from the 8th or the 9th century that the Panchatantra was translated into Syriac, the oldest available translation. Now, Syriac is one of the languages of Syria. It's a Semitic language from the same family as Hebrew and Arabic. And we know that there were early translations already into Arabic. We know of a 10th or maybe 11th or 12th century translation from Indonesia into the language that we now call Old Javanese. And through this translation into Syriac and then Arabic, the tales of the Panchatantra, with of course minor modifications culturally. If the crow is trying to get a vada, perhaps it was trying to get a pie in some Mediterranean version. We find that these stories were widely circulated, and they were reworked. And of course, if there's I don't know if there's a character called Damanaka, his name is changed to Daman or something like that, which suits the local language. And the spread of these stories, I feel, is something we don't appreciate enough. We speak about the travels of Alexander, but do we know about the travels of the stories of Alexander? So if Alexander traveled over great territories and supposedly conquered them, and he's remembered in all of these places, the Panchatantra conquered an even larger territory. and conquer without any violence, in that they captured the memories and the imagination of all the people that heard these stories. Okay, now what is knowledge? As like I said earlier, it's kind of a fraught question, and often the very debates that underlie universities and what can and cannot be studied at university is based upon this question of what we recognize as meaningful knowledge or important knowledge and what we don't recognize. And there's always a complex question. So say we know that carbon and hydrogen and oxygen are elements. We know that sugar, or whatever, glucose or sucrose, is a compound. Now, one could call this some kind of knowledge. But what is a knowledge system? When we develop principles, when we develop a framework that defines ways of interpreting these things, that's called a knowledge system. So when you're able to identify things, you're giving them names, that's kind of knowledge. But then when we develop a systematic way of identifying, naming, classifying, making sense, appreciating things, that's a knowledge system. So in a way, one could say what we call a discipline today, or what is called a little bit, unfortunately, as a subject in the terminology of schools, that is a knowledge system. So anything that can be, put down not just as facts, but also as concepts and as principles is a knowledge system. And we could call it a discipline. And the term that was used for this, which is kind of a conceptual parallel in Sanskrit, is the word Shastra. And of course, today one hears the word Shastra used in rather narrow circumstances. When somebody tells you to do something or not to do something, and you ask them, hey, why should I not do this? They'll tell you, it's said in the Shastra, as if that's some big monolith that defines all our do's and don'ts. And I recommend that the next time somebody tells you, you should do this because it's the Shastra, or you shouldn't do this because it's the Shastra, you ask a question, which Shastra? Could you tell me which Shastra says that? What is Shastra? And we realize that this is, again, a broad term which covers anything that the human mind has decided that this is worth thinking about, this is worth thinking about in a systematic way. So traditionally, you have knowledge systems or Shastras, not just for lofty things like philosophy, which is studied in Vedanta Shastra, or grammar, which is studied in Vyakarana Shastra, but also if you're studying administration and politics, which was studied in Artha Shastra, or if you're studying the nature of relationships and love, which is studied in Kama Shastra, everything. If you studied theater and music, it was called Natya Shastra, but you could study precious gems and semi-precious gems, it would be called Ratna Shastra. And the list goes on and on. If you study perfumes, it's called Gandha Shastra. You study the science of the veterinary science of elephants or horses, they are Gaja Shastra, Ashwa Shastra. The science of the kitchen, it's called Paka Shastra. And there are texts written in many, many of these. There's even a Shastra for how to make sword blades. And some of these are written down in text, and some of these are not, and they just persist. We don't have a written down text, as far as I know, in any of the languages for pottery. But clearly, there was a very sophisticated science of making terracotta and pottery and so on. And these two are shastras. They just haven't been written down, and they persist in the knowledge and in the practice of traditional professionals. Okay, so this was just a kind of prelude, but let's come to our topic, which is Indian literature. And the question that we should ask ourselves is literature a knowledge system? So can literature be the topic of Shastra? And I'll try and spend the next 45 odd minutes arguing why it is, why indeed literature and the study of literature is a knowledge system or a Shastra, and perhaps it's the most important one. But then I am a bit biased This is my favorite topic. Okay, as we saw in this map, we cannot cover every single language and the literature of all of these languages. So we'll kind of sample a bit from here and there. So in Sanskrit, the term for understanding something by sampling little bits from here and there is sthali pulakanyaya. It means checking if a pot of rice is cooked by just tasting one grain. You can't check if the pot is cooked by eating the whole pot. Then you'll have to cook another pot. And I think there's also an idiom for this in Tamil. It's called panaikku chotru padam, I think, to check if the full pot of rice is cooked.
We say oru paanai sotrukku oru soru padam.
Yes, oru soru padam, meaning one grain of rice is enough to test to get a sense of the whole pot. And we're going to do the same with our literatures. Your textbook also says that the purpose is, I quote, not to impart masses of knowledge, masses of data, but to highlight concepts and achievements. I don't know about achievements, but certainly I would like to give you a flavor of these texts and also some interesting ways of how to read them and how to appreciate them. So rather than give you a kind of attendance register of the great poets and their texts, let's read a little bit from selections of text. I see that someone has drawn a beautiful line. Thank you very much.
Please don't do annotations now, please. It's not appropriate. Yeah.
So we're going to read mainly from three texts, selections from three texts, and then let's see if you have time left for other things. We're going to read a selection from the Sanskrit Ramayana, the oldest version of it, as we know, from Valmiki. And then we'll read a bit from a poem of the Sanskrit poet Kalidasa. We'll read a couple of delightful selections from a collection of Prakrit poems called the Gaha Satasai or the Gatha Saptashati. And then let's see, if you have time, we'll do something else. I apologize not for bringing material from Tamil, since after all, your school is in Tamil Nadu, and it's the other big corpus of very important, very interesting literature. I hope someone else does a session with that. So we'll begin with the Ramayana. Now, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are often referred to as the epics. Now, this is a category that was primarily used to describe the great, long oral poems that one found in Greece. The poems of Homer were called epics, and they had certain features. You could see that there are many lines that repeat. There are these formulaic repetitions. They are huge stories on a very large scale with many, many characters. And it is very clear, even from the written versions of the poem, that they have an oral quality, that they were remembered and repeated and recited. We also see this about the Ramayana. I'm sure everybody in some version knows the story of the Ramayana. And we read the Ramayana not like a detective novel, not to see, oh, what's going to happen in the next episode. Everyone kind of knows the bare bones of the story, if not the details. But what we're looking for is not what the story is, but rather how the story is told. So if you read the play of Kalidasa based on the Shakuntala story, everyone kind of, I think, you have a Wikipedia version of the story. So there's going to be no surprises when you go from scene to scene. So the appreciation and the aesthetic experience is not so much in the what's going to happen next, as much as how it has been told. And it's the same with the Ramayana. Now, why is the Ramayana important? In the Sanskrit literary tradition, it's considered the first kavya. Though this is not quite true, there are features of kavya already in the Veda. There are very, very poetic passages in the Veda and also in the later part in the Upanishad. But because the traditions say so, and I think there's good reasons why they believe that there's a particular episode, the episode that kind of stirred the poet Valmiki to write the Ramayana, that can also be seen as a moment that is kind of paradigmatic for how poetry begins. And again, it's a story you all know, but instead of just receiving it as a story, let's see how it's been told by the poet themselves. So we'll see the kind of the frame story of the Ramayana in the poet's own words. Okay, so that's a beautiful illustration from a Mughal manuscript of the Ramayana in translation. And let's read a bit. So this is my model. We'll read from the verses, we'll read the translations, and we'll discuss them after every block of verses. So this is from the first chapter. Something that's special about both the epics of India is that you find that these poets were so involved in writing these epics. They were so involved, they were so deep into them that they fell into them. So both of the poets of the epic, Vyasa and Valmiki, they feature in their own poems. And this is quite an unusual thing. It's not often that you find somebody writing themselves as a character into the poem. And this happens in the frame story of the Ramayana. And Vyasa, of course, he's all over the Mahabharata. He's an important character. He's related to everybody in the story. Okay, so let's read this bits of these verses, which are from the frame story about when Valmiki first came up with poetry. Satutiram samasadya tamasaya mahamunihi shishyamaha sthitam parshve drishtva tirtham akardamam idam tirtham bharadwaja nishamaya ramaniyam prasannambu sanmanushya mano yatha. So Valmiki is going with his disciple to bathe in the river. So they reached Tiram Samasadya Tamasaya. They reached the banks of the Tamasa river. There are many places in India where they identified. Some people identified in Madhya Pradesh. So maybe Valmiki lived somewhere in Madhya Pradesh, and Tamasa is some minor river there. And he told his student, who was by his side, having looked at this tirtha, at this bathing place in the river, that was clear and that wasn't slushy. Akardamam. And then he appreciates how the place is. Akardamam idam tirtham Bharadwaja. So he's telling his student Bharadwaja, look at this tirtha, which is Akardama, this bathing place that is so clean. There's no mud and slush here. How is it? It is Ramaniyam, it is beautiful, and it's transparent, prasanna, it's lucid. And then he gives a beautiful comparison. He says, it's clear and lucid, it's clear and transparent, like the mind of a good person. San manushya manaha. So we can see already that poetry is already born before the birth of poetry. He's already making very nice observation about what is a kind of precondition for the appreciation of poetry to happen. If you don't have, an undisturbed mind, if you don't have a sensitive, receptive mind, then there can be no poetry. It makes no sense. You just find it all to be word salad. You say, what is this gibberish? If you're not in a state of mind to be receptive. And what happens next? He saw a pair of geese. He saw a pair of sarasa, cranes, kraunchas. So tasyabhyashe tumithunam charantam anapayinam. So he saw a mithuna, a pair of krauncha birds. Kraunchayoho mithunam. Dadarsha bhagavan tatra kraunchayoho charuniswanam. So Bhagavan, meaning this holy man, he saw on the banks of that river a pair of krauncha birds. And how were they? Anapayan. They couldn't be separated from each other. They were very close to each other. They were in love. And they were charuniswanam. They were making all these charming bird calls. Meanwhile, tasmatu mithunat ekam humansam papanishchayah jaghana vaira nilayo nishadaha tasya pashyataha. And even as Valmiki was looking on, tasya pashyataha, tasmad mithunat, out of that pair of birds, pumausam nishadaha jaghana. There was a hunter, and he was vairanilayo, he was full of aggression. Ekam pumausam jaghana, and he shot down the bird, he shot down the male crauncha bird. And then, of course, the bird died. The female bird started wailing piteously. And Valmiki was really moved by this. So, Nishamya Rudatim Kraunchim Idam Vachanam Abravid. He heard the crauncha hen calling out, wailing, and then he said the following. He's furious that this hunter has shot down the bird, and so he utters a curse. And we'll see how these moments of great emotional upheaval and curses are kind of significant in Indian literature. Often we see that they are triggers for literature or great poetry. What is the curse that Valmiki called out? Ma nishada pratishtham tvam agama shashwatim samaha yat krauncha mithunat ekam avadhi kama mohitam. He says, hey hunter, nishada, ma pratishtham agamaha. You're not going to be very stable. You're not going to live shashwatim samaha for a very long time. I curse you that you're not going to be peaceful and you're not going to live for long. Why? Krauncha mithunat ekam avadhihi. Out of this pair of kraunchas, you killed one. It almost seems like Valmiki is saying that the fact that you killed one of them and not two of them, meaning that you left the other one in pain and pining, that is your great crime. And we can see how Valmiki is really moved by the kind of piteous cries of this bird. We see this frequently in the Ramayana. Also, when Rama goes away to the forest, it says, Kraunchinam ivanarinam ninadastatra shushruve. So the mothers were crying like female crauncha birds, like crauncha hens would wail. And if you can go look it up. The call of the Saras bird is very close to the voice of a person wailing or crying. And this, as you all famously know, is the moment when poetry was born. So Valmiki's shoka, his grief, turned into this verse. So instead of just swearing at the hunter, he came up with this verse, and then he surprised himself. And this kind of moment of extreme emotion, and it was not emotion felt for personal loss, nothing happened to Valmiki, but born out of empathy, born out of concern for the other, and this moment of love and loss and sorrow, it becomes a trigger for poetry. And later, towards the end, I'd like us to reflect on why is this moment significant as the point when poetry was born. What is the connection between an ordinary everyday scene, like a hunter shooting a bird? That's what hunters do. They kill animals for a livelihood. They're not veterinarians. They don't go and heal animals. They kill animals for food and their skins and so on. What's the connection between this and the rest of the story, the whole Ramayana epic? Surely this may have happened, it may not have happened, but it has to make some kind of literary sense. It has to make some kind of poetic sense. So what is the connection between this episode of a hunter coming and seeing this pair of birds deeply in love and then causing great sorrow to one of them by killing the other? What's the connection between this and the rest of the story, which is the subject of the Ramayana epic? We'll talk about this in the end. Okay, let's move on and read some samples from another very different type of poem. So if the Ramayana is an epic with a long, continuous narrative, the poem that we're going to read has short standalone verses, and each verse is an independent poem by itself. If the Ramayana is in Sanskrit, this text that we're going to read from, which is an anthology, is a collection of Prakrit verses. And if the Ramayana is in large part concerned with gods and kings, though it's also set in forests and so on, these Prakrit poems are by and large concerned not with cities, but with the village, the fields, and also occasionally with the forest. So let's read a bit from the Prakrit collection called the Gaha Satasai. Now, it's a bit difficult to identify a single author. It's attributed to a Shatavahana king who ruled over parts of the Deccan, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, and so on, called Shatavahana Hala. Now, there may have been a king of this name, and we haven't really found any inscriptions by him, but tradition tells us that there was the Shatavahana king, and he collected these poems. So one of the names for so let me explain the name to you. Gatha means a certain kind of poem or song, and these were meant to be recited or sung. And Satasai in Prakrit corresponds to Saptashati in Sanskrit, which means 700. So it's supposed to be a collection or an anthology of 700 verses. We find different versions all over India. It was hugely popular, and if you collect the verses from all of these together, it's much, much more than 700. It's over 1,000 verses. And another name for this is the Gaha Kosa, the word Kosa or Kosha, meaning a treasury. So like one collects gems, one picks the best gems and makes a collection in their treasury. One can imagine this king or poet, Hala, collecting what he thought were the most sophisticated and good poems in Prakrit written by different authors. So from some manuscripts, we even know the names of the authors of individual poems, but many of these poems are just anonymous. Okay, so let's read a bit from the Gaha Satasai. This first verse is in praise of poetry itself. So, Amiyam Pau Kavam Padhyum Soum Cha Jena Ananti Kamasatatantim Hunanti Te Kaha Analajjanti. So this says that Prakrit poetry, Pau Kavam, Amiyam, is like Amrita. It's like, nectar of immortality. And Padhyum Soum Chajena Ananti, those who don't know how to recite and how to listen to this poetry and who can't appreciate this poetry, Kamasatatantim. So what do they know to talk about love? What can they explain about these texts of love? Don't they feel ashamed talking about love? What do we know about Prakrit as a language and as a language system? So let me tell you the kind of the highlights of the most common view. From texts like the Natya Shastra, we know that in the plays, the higher characters, those with a higher social status, speak Sanskrit. And characters who are like common people or the less literate or the less elite characters speak Prakrit. So the women, the children, the jokers, and so on. And people believe that the poems in Prakrit are all very simple poems. They reflect simple village life. There's not complex poetic figures in them. And let me rush to tell you that all of this is wrong. It's true that in the plays, as a conventional format, Sanskrit is used for the more elite characters, the more literate characters. Prakrit is used for the simpler characters, less elite characters. But by the time of the preparation of this anthology, Prakrit was as prestigious and it was a court language as much and perhaps more than Sanskrit. If you think about it, the earliest inscriptions we found that we can understand, if we don't count those Indus Valley inscriptions, which we can't really understand, the oldest inscriptions we find are all in Prakrit. The Ashokan inscriptions are in Prakrit, and inscriptions that are close in time to the Gahasatasai, the early Gupta, Vakataka inscriptions that we find from the Deccan, they are all in Prakrit, and it's only later that we see them appearing in Sanskrit. So by this time, the idea of Prakrit being a common, it must have been at a certain time that Prakrit was the language of the common people and so on. But by this time, it has already become a sophisticated language. It was being used to write highly polished poetry, just as we associate with Sanskrit. It was a literary language, and it had a highly complex literary system. And the standalone poems of these Prakrit collection, I think, are best compared to the early Tamil poems that one sees in the Agananur. And one kind of dominant theme that runs through these Prakrit poems is that of love. And it could be domestic love, love between people who marry to each other, but it could also just be romantic love in other situations, like furtive love, people who are going out and secretively having a little romantic rendezvous. All of these are the topics of the Prakrit collection, and this is frequently emphasized, as we see even in this line. They don't say that those who don't know, those who can't appreciate Prakrit poetry are bad at literature. They say that those who can't appreciate Prakrit poetry, they don't understand love. What's the point of them trying to read texts about love, about Kamashastra, if they can't understand this poetry? So this is a very significant point that this poem is drawing attention to. Okay, let's look at another example from the Gahasatasai. Hasiyam sahatta thalam sukkhavadam uvagayehi pahiyehi patta phalana sarise uddine pusavindammi. So it's a really delightful scene that is being described. There are these pahiyas, these pathikas, fellows who go walking long distances, travelers. So they saw a fig tree, they saw a banyan tree, and they're walking towards the banyan tree. Why? Because banyan trees have nice leafy shade. They have all these bright red figs on them. And they saw it from a distance and they started walking towards it, saying, it's very hot, you can go rest in the shade for a while. But then a flock of parrots flew away from the tree, perhaps seeing these people walking towards it. And then they realized that the tree is a bare skeleton. And what they thought were the leaves and the figs are just the birds that were flocking thickly all over the tree. And when they realized their folly, these travelers, they weren't sad. They just laughed at their own folly, and they kind of mocked themselves that, we thought that this tree was full of fruit and leaves, but it turns out it's just parrots. Now, this kind of, on the surface, it's very simple, but you can see how there are layers to this verse. And I'm sure one can also read a second register of meaning in a poem like this. And I'd like to ask you in the end that you remember this poem and perhaps think about what could be the suggested meaning in a verse such as this one. Okay, let's read another verse from the Gahasatasai. One could call it the, if one had to list the greatest hits of Sanskrit Prakrit poetry, this verse that we're going to read now would feature there. It's like the superstar verse of Sanskrit poetics. It's even been cited by the greatest theorist of Sanskrit poetry, Anandavardhana. So the verse goes, Bhamadhamya visaddho so sunaho ajja mario dena gola adavi kudanga vasina daryasihena. So he's saying, whoever is saying this poem, and we're going to see in a moment, Dhamya, O monk, O holy person, visaddho bhama, you can walk about without any fear, Visrabdha. That dog, so Sunaho, presumably some dog that these two people are both familiar with, Ajja Marido, he's been killed. So you don't have to fear that dog. He's been killed. Dena Gola Adavi Kudanga Vasina Darya Sinhena. So that dog that used to be so afraid of, it's been killed by a fierce lion, Darya Simha, Dripta Simha, that lives in the reeds, the thickets by the river Gola or Godavari. So you can see that there's something suggestive going on here. And the commentators, they're very helpful, and they help us by supplying some context to this verse. So this is a young woman from the village talking to a monk who kind of roams around in this village, asking for alms. And he sometimes goes and, I don't know, perhaps meditates on the banks of the Godavari River. And the commentators tell us that this poem is actually, again, in a romantic situation. So the woman who's saying this poem, she's made plans to meet her sweetheart by the banks of the Godavari. And she finds out that this monk he tends to go in the evenings and sit by the bank of the river. And he's perhaps been troubled by a dog that hangs around over there. So she finds a very clever way to dissuade him from going there by telling him, oh, but you can go there. You have no reason to be afraid, because the dog that you used to be afraid of is no longer there. But why is the dog no longer there? Because there's a lion there. And you know that this is a surest way of ensuring that somebody won't go there. Because if you're afraid of a dog, you're going to be much more afraid of a lion. And this is this young woman's way of ensuring that the monk won't go to the bank of the river and she can be there undisturbed with her friend. Now, this verse is used by this literary theorist Anandavardhana from the 9th century, Kashmir, to illustrate a literary principle called dhvani, or literary suggestion, literary allusion. We can't go too much into the idea of dhvani, but it means meaning that is more than what meets the eye. For example, if I go on and on about this verse, Shanti, madam, may butt in and say, hey, Naresh, it's almost 11 o'clock. And what does it mean if she tells me it's almost 11 o'clock? It's not just that she's telling me what the time is, isn't it? There's more to it. She's telling me, look, you're taking up too much time, or you should start winding up, or it's time for a lunch break. And all of these meanings, we can, from our knowledge of the context, that I'm giving this lecture, it began at 11, it began at 10, we're supposed to kind of wind up before 12. When we have the knowledge of this context, then a statement like this saying, hey, it's 11 o'clock, it gains different meaning. It's not just an announcement of the time, like you would hear, say, in the railway station or the metro station, where somebody announces, it is 11 o'clock. There it just means it's 11 o'clock and so train is going to come. But here, it can mean many other things. Just like that, in our verse, when this young woman is telling the monk, and of course, the young woman is supplied by the commentators, and it seems to be a reasonable way of interpreting this poem, we understand that we supply the context, and we understand that while it seems to be saying, yeah, it's fine, you can go to the riverbanks now, that the poem actually points to the opposite. So in a way, we see that these poems are all grounded in you've only seen 3 samples, you'll have to take my word for it, but there are very good translations of the Gaha Satasai, you can read them. You'll see that they're kind of grounded in the natural world. But the purpose of these poems is not merely to show you the beauties of the natural world. So it's not like a Nat Geo documentary. Rather, they use this exterior natural world of, plants and animals and natural phenomena to encode things connected to the interior world, to the world of emotions and experiences. And there's kind of a code language that's operating in which these topics of the outer world are being mustered to speak about goings-on of the inner world. And in my view, a large part of the joy of reading poetry of each particular system, of each kind of poetic culture, is in kind of figuring out and learning how to decode the secret language. The language of each of these bodies of poetry. They have their own internal logic. And figuring out how they use these codes, I think, is one of the great joys of reading poetry. Okay, so let's go to the third set of material that I have. And this is from Sanskrit, from one of the important poets, the Sanskrit tradition, one of the earlier poets of the Sanskrit tradition, Kalidasa. So he lived in Gupta Vakataka times, and he seemed to have an intimate understanding of the whole subcontinent. Because he praises the Himalayas and he seems to describe them in great detail, people from Kashmir like to say that, you know what, Kalidasa was from Kashmir. And because he speaks a lot about Madhya Pradesh, Vidisha, Ujjain, Mahakala, people from Madhya Pradesh love to say that. No, of course not. He was from Madhya Pradesh. And since he also speaks about the Deccan, about Maharashtra, Vidarbha, people from there like to say, no, of course not. Look at our poetry. We write fine poetry just like Kalidasa. He's from here. But we don't have to worry about this. We don't have to find which pin code Kalidasa lived in. But certainly, this just tells us about the popularity of his literature and how, in a way, he's a national poet of sorts. His poems were read all over, they were circulated all over, they were imitated all over. And this is kind of a sure sign of how important he was as a poet. Oh, yes, there's a picture of the fierce lion that is lurking in the Godavari. Okay, so we'll read some samples from what is perhaps the most unique and the most productive poem of Kalidasa, a poem called the Meghaduta. I hope you've all heard about it. We'll read some short samples, but I'll also summarize what happens in the text. The world changed after the Meghaduta or the Megha Sandesha came into existence. It's a unique poem. It's about an unknown hero. The hero is a nobody. It's a somebody. And it's in a new meter. It's in a meter that we haven't ever heard before. And like the Ramayana and many other important poems, it also begins with a curse. So I'll read the verses and bits of the translation so that you get a sense of the sheer musicality of these verses. Kashchit kanta viraha guruna swadhikara pramatta शापेनास्तं गमितमहिमा वर्षभोग्येन भर्तुः यक्षश्चक्रे जनकतनया स्नानपुण्योदकेषु स्निग्धच्छाया तरुषु वसतिं रामगिर्याश्रमेषु. So look at how the poem begins. It says Kashchit, which means somebody. There was someone. And it's some yaksha. Kanta viraha guruna. He was weighed down by separation from his wife, from his lover. Swadhikara pramattaha. He was stripped of his job. He was demoted from his job. His master, Bharta, had cursed him, shapena, and taken away all his powers for the duration of a year. Varsha bhogyena shapena. So he had to be under this curse for one long year. And then we meet our subject in the third line, Yaksha. There was this Yaksha. And what did he do? He was cursed to live in Mount Rama, Ramagiri. And how is this place? It has holy waters, Punyodakeshu, that have been purified by Sita bathing there, Janakatanaya. Janakatanaya snana Punyodakeshu. Waters that are sacred, Punya, because of being bathed, snana, by Janakatanaya, Sita, the daughter of Janaka. You can see how the compound goes backwards. And this place also has thick shady trees, Snigdha Chaya Tarush. So what's the summary? There's a Yaksha. He did something wrong. He was cursed by his master. Who's the master of the Yakshas? Kubera. that he has to go away, be separated from his wife, lose all his magic powers, and live in this place, Ramagiri. We kind of identify it now near Nagpur in a hill called Ramtek. And this was part of the Vakataka Empire. And we have very strong reason to believe that Kalidasa could have been in this court. So he may have actually spent some time in this hill called Ramtek. It's still very picturesque. It's kind of part of the Western Ghats. And we see many of these signature features of Kavya that we already saw, that it's kind of sensitively ensconced in the natural world, that it's connected to sentiment, it's connected to a curse. Let's read on. And yeah, there's this beautiful postage stamp. It's from a set of 2 postage stamps made on the theme of Kalidasa. And we'll see it in a little more resolution in the next slide. I've magnified it here. And you can see that the stamp even quotes from the verse that we're going to read now. So, Tasmin nadrau katichid apala viprayuktah sakami nitva masan kanaka valaya bhramusha rikta prakoshtah ashadhasya prathama divase meghamashlishtha sanum vapra krida parinata gaja prekshaniyam dadarsha. So this person who is very much in love, Sakami, separated from his beloved, Abala Viprayuktaha, Katichit, Masa Nitva, he spent a few months. And what happened meanwhile? He became thin, he became emaciated. Brahmusharikta Prakoshtaha. How does he tell us that he's become thin? The ornaments he used to wear on his arms have slipped down. So his arm is bare of any ornaments. It's kind of this elusive way of telling us that he was, he just wasted away. He's lost weight. And then, Ashadhasya Prathama Divase, on the first day of the Ashadha month, he saw a cloud on top of the hill. Ashlishta Sanum. He saw this cloud that was swirling around the peak of the hill like an elephant playing on top of the hill. And these 2 lines, Ashadhasya Prathama Divase, and so on, have been cited at the bottom of the stamp. And this painting is by an eminent poet that we don't know so much about today, called Radha Kumar Bagchi, who was trained in the Shantiniketan school. And he made several stamps based on themes from the poetry of Kalidasa. Okay, let's read on a bit more. And so this guy, I'm not going to read the verses now, I'll just read from the translations. This Yaksha, he somehow managed to stand up and face the cloud. Kathamapi, somehow, with some difficulty, Tasya Sthitva Puraha, he stood in front of this cloud. And then Antarbashpam, he held back his tears. And then he spoke to the cloud. And the poet says a very beautiful thing. Megha loke bhavati sukhino api anyata vritti chetaha. When you look at a cloud, there's something special about a monsoon cloud. Even people who are happy, they get moved and they have things going on in their heart. And what can you say about people who are separated from their lovers? It's going to just make them really sad to see a cloud. And this is kind of a topos, a theme in Indian poetry. You see it in the Tamil poems, you see it in the Prakrit poems, the Sanskrit poems, that people who are separated from their lovers, they miss them terribly. But they do so especially in the monsoon. And the moment the monsoon comes and the monsoon clouds come, then they feel this separation and this pining with much more intensity. And this kind of is one of the themes of the Shakuntala, of the Meghaduta, sorry. You can also notice that there's something special about the meter, and this meter, we can say, the meter of this verse was perhaps invented by Kalidasa. We don't see it before his poems. And you can see that it begins with 4 heavy syllables. So, tasya sthit dva, or Megha loke. And so it's kind of with gaps. But then you have this rush of 5 short syllables, light syllables. So tasya sthitva kathamapi pura antar bashpash chiramanucharo. And I hope you can all appreciate the cadence of how it goes first slow, and then there's a rush of 5 short syllables. And I'm tempted to think that this almost kind of resembles the way we experience the rain. So, when the rain is just beginning, you hear and there. And then after this patter of a few drops, there's a rush, and it comes all at once. And I feel somehow in the rhythmic cadence of this meter, he set it up that he captures the way the rain comes on. I don't know. I'd like to hear what you think. This is my feeling. Okay. So this yaksha, he stood in front of the cloud, and he decided that he's going to send a letter through the cloud because he's cursed. He doesn't have magic powers. He can't fly. But the cloud, he has all the powers that a cloud has. He can fly wherever he likes. And he knows that the cloud is kind of going to fly up from. So obviously, the yaksha had studied the CBSE 8th grade geography textbook. So he knows how the monsoon clouds go. He knows that they're going to go up there, go towards the northeast, and then take a turn and go towards the Himalaya. So he knows this cloud is exactly going to go where his wife is living, pining for him in the Himalayas, because that's where the yakshas live. So he gives it a message. Swakushalamayi pravrittim. So he asked this cloud, so can you take a message that I'm fine, and can you go ask her to be brave? And then sapratyagraihi kutajakusumaihi kalpitarghaya tasmai preetah priviti pramukha vachanam swagatam vyajahar. So this yaksha decided that he's going to welcome this cloud. So he gave him swagata, he welcomed him. Preeti pramukha vachanaihi, with some sweet words, and he also offered him a handful of wild flowers, because in what else will you find in the Western Ghats? You're not going to find a bouquet of chrysanthemums and roses. So Kutaja Kusuma. And this is significant because in some parts of South India, the name for the Western Ghats is Kutachadri or Kodachadri. And that's because the Kutaja flowers grow over there. I think it's called Palai in Tamil and Malayalam. They are these white, mildly fragrant flowers. And this is what he could find there. And this is what the yaksha used. So he took a handful of Kutaja flowers, and you can see it in the painting as well, offered it to the cloud, and spoke to him in sweet words, welcoming him, hoping that the cloud will take his message. Okay. And this, of course, has been a topic of kind of debate and controversy in the world of Sanskrit poetry. Several centuries after Kalidasa, there was a theorist called Bhamaha, and he said, people can't do all these crazy things. They can't have messages being carried by clouds and birds and beasts. Of course, messages have to be carried by trained couriers who know how to memorize a message, to go and repeat it, and you can't have all this nonsense. Now, whatever the grammarians of poetry may say, we know that this poem is a grand success, and many, many poets afterwards have followed in the footsteps of Kalidasa and written similar poems where somebody carries a love letter, carries a message of love, and that somebody is more and more unusual and weird in example after example. So you have Sandesha poems where it's not just a cloud, but it could be a bird, it could be a cuckoo, a crow, a vulture, even. It could be a bat. And in one of these Jaina poems, the poet sends his own mind. Somebody asks the moon, so there's a Chandra Duta or a Chandra Sandesha. And also in Tamil, you have this genre of minor poems, Sitrilakyam, called the Tud. So poems where somebody sends an object often as their messenger to convey the message. And from the 18th and 19th century, you even have some rather cheeky to the poems. So there's a to the poem from Tirunelveli called Panam Vidu Thudu. So this poet who was irritated that his patron doesn't recognize his skill and is only interested in all these other court poets who are already rich and who know how to praise him. He says that the only language that people understand today is money, panam. So I'm going to send money as my messenger, and it can take my message to the king. So here we find already that the poet is doing this. He's saying, is this a little bit crazy that I'm sending a cloud as my messenger? After all, what is a cloud? Dhuma jyoti salila marutam sannipata. It's just an amalgam of some smoke, some lightning, some water, and some air. And really, for you need someone who's really smart, really eloquent, and can clouds do all these things. And then we have kind of a message at the end of the verse. It says, Kama hi prakriti kripanaha chetana chetaneshu. Somebody who's desperate in love, someone who's kama they become indiscriminate, prakriti kripana. They cannot tell the difference, chetana achetaneshu. They cannot tell difference between, are you an intelligent being and unintelligent being? Do you have real intelligence? Do you have artificial intelligence? Are you sentient? Are you insentient? They don't care. They're so desperate, they'd like to talk to somebody about the love and suffering that they're undergoing, and they'd like to pass on a message through them. So you can see that this question that Kalidasa seems to be asking here: Does love drive you crazy? Does it make you do crazy things? And we're going to skip through a whole bunch of poems because this Yaksha, he sees the cloud as a friend. So he doesn't tell him the route in a straight line, like your Google Maps would tell you the shortest route where there's no traffic jams. He doesn't tell the shortest route to Himalaya. Rather, in several verses, perhaps 30 or 40 verses, he gives this beautiful description of several points in the landscape of central India, from Maharashtra, through central India, through northern India, all the way to the Himalayas. And so we don't have time for all of those verses. And he'll frequently describe along the path to the cloud other people who are in love. And he'll tell him, hey, listen, you be kind to these other lovers because I know the situation of people who are in love, and you should be sensitive to them. You should be kind to them. So he says, people who are sneaking up to meet their lovers, you light their path if it's dark. You be helpful to them. Don't scare them. And he says, also you, on your path, when it becomes night, you rest somewhere along with your wife, who's lightning. But then the moment there's daybreak, you should go on a trip, and you shouldn't take too long to convey my message. So the Yaksha is also sympathetic to the love of the cloud. He's sympathetic to the love of strangers that the cloud may meet on its path. And then finally, towards the end of the text, we get his love letter, we get his message. So what's the message he asked the cloud to convey? He said, first of all, introduce yourself. Say that you're not a stranger, you're my friend. So say that, Bhartur Mitram, I'm a cloud and I'm your husband's friend. And then address her as Avidhave, meaning tell her that your husband has not died. He's fine. He's okay. He may not be in great shape, but he's okay. And then with your thunder, you tell her that I'm going to come soon, and tell her not to worry too much. And I'll come and I'll braid her hair again. And it's almost like an anticlimax. What is supposed to be a poem, which is the love letter of this Yaksha, we see at the end of more than 120 verses, there's this brief message. And I'd like us to reflect on, so if this poem is indeed a love letter, what kind of love letter is it? Is it about the Yaksha's message of love to his wife, who's sitting somewhere in the Himalayas? Or is it Kalidasa's love letter to poetry, and Kalidasa's love letter to the landscapes of India? Okay, I think we are a little bit short on time, so we'll read, we'll skip a verse that I have on people getting confused. But this, so I was telling you how productive the Meghaduta is, and it has kind of inspired people, not just in Sanskrit, but in other languages, to write several kind of imitations of the Meghaduta. And we also have this very creative kind of fictional biography of Kalidasa, written by the Hindi poet Mohan Rakesh. And he chooses this verse, the second verse of the Meghaduta, to frame it, and he calls it Ashad ka ek din. So the first day or one day of the month, Ashad. In the second verse, we saw how the Yaksha spoke to the cloud on the first day of the monsoon, on the first day of the Ashad month. And what Mohan Rakesh does is he takes bits and bobs from all the poems and plays of Kalidasa, and he kind of rewrites a fictional biography of him, saying that it must have been events from his own life and things that he saw around him that made him put those things into his poems and plays. It's a fantastic book. That's the Hindi poet Mohan Rakesh, and it's also been made into a play. I think it's a very popular play in Hindi and also in other languages. It's called Ashad Ka Ek Din, and sometimes Ashad Ki Ek Raat. Okay, so this is a fantastic poem from the 8th century Gujarat, Maghas Shishupala. It's a Mahakavya, and I would have liked us to go through it, but I think we're a little short on time. So we'll skip ahead to a verse in which a theorist of poetry, an author of Alankara Shastra called Mammata from the 11th, 12th centuries, he tries to give a definition of poetry, but he gives it in his prayer to Saraswati. So let's look at that verse, and maybe if there's time during the discussions, we can come back to this verse that I skipped. So this is a textbook on Kavya. It's called the Kavya Prakasha, Light on Poetry, or the Light of Poetry, by Mammata Bhatta from Kashmir, 12th century. Very important textbook. And he begins, like many texts, he begins his textbook with a prayer. We had this, so the beginning of our session, we had someone recite nice verses on Saraswati. He too has written a verse on Bharati, or Saraswati, the goddess of speech. But this is not ordinary speech. She is Bharati Kavehe. So I'll read the verse and then the translation. Niyati Krita Niyama Rahitam Hladaikamayim Ananya Paratantram Navarasa Ruchiram Nirmitim Adadati Bharati Kavehe Jayati. So Bharati Jayati, the goddess of speech, is splendid, Jayati, but this is not ordinary speech. Kavehe Bharati, the poet's speech. So what is poet's speech? It's kavya, it's poetry or literature. And he says, what does this goddess of speech do when she's poetry? Nirmitim adadhati, she makes a new universe. She creates a parallel universe. And what kind of universe is this? It is niyati krita niyama rahita. It is independent of the rules, niyama, of niyati, of nature. So the rules that apply in the natural world don't apply in this parallel universe that is poetry. And what is the nature of this world? It is hladai kamayi. It's of the nature of delight. There's only pleasure. So if you're reading a poem which is about sad things, if you're watching a movie that's about, there's scenes of action, there's bombs exploding, it doesn't make us sad. These are negative emotions. But because it's aesthetic, we derive pleasure from it. If you saw a news report, if you saw a documentary about war and about bombs exploding, about people who are not able to, who are separated from their family members, that makes us very sad. But when we read poetry, we saw samples just now from Kalidasa about this person who's separated from their beloved, and kind of the golden touch of poetry converts all of this into aesthetic experience. This becomes pleasurable. Why? Are we sadists? Do we take pleasure in the sorrow of others? No. But this is the kind of the alchemy of poetry, in that also negative emotions sorrow, fight, battle, conflict, all of this becomes aesthetic and we are able to appreciate it. Okay, and what else is the nature of poetry, the goddess of poetry? She's Ananya Paratantra, she's independent of everyone else, doesn't depend on anything. It's Nava Rasa Ruchira, it is splendid or radiant with the 9 rasas or with the new rasas. Nava can mean both 9, can mean new. This is the nature of poetry. And I think that there couldn't be a better verse that at once is kind of a praise of the goddess. Of course, the goddess has all these divine qualities. She is not controlled by any rules. She is not restrained by anybody. The goddess is in a state of permanent happiness and bliss and so on. But at the same time, this is a description of literature, of kavya. Literature, it's not that there are no rules in literature. You can't do anything. You can't say anything. There are rules, but they're not the rules of the outside world. There's an internal logic of its own. So if in the poetry, it says that the Ashoka tree will bear flowers out of season when kicked by a young woman. You can't ask, is this true in the real world? Shall I go try kick an Ashoka tree and see if it will bear flowers? You can try. I will only give you a small precaution that you should kick it gently. Why? Why should you kick it gently? Because if you kick it hard, your leg will pain. So this is a little peep into the universe of poetry, which is made up of only delight, hlada, ananda, which is ananya paratantra, which is not dependent on anything else, which is niyati krita niyama rahita, which is independent of the rules of the natural world, of the ordinary world, which is navarasa ruchira, which is splendid with various emotions and sentiments. And I think if we look back now in light of Mamata's definition, we will see that all of this holds true for the samples of poetry that we saw from Kalidasa, from Valmiki, and from all the anonymous poets in the Prakrit collection of Hala, the Gahasatas. Okay, I'm going to stop speaking now, and we can take any questions, we can have a discussion, and if there's time, we'll go back to that poem from Magha. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I can share it again if you need to look at something. Are you speaking, Shanti madam? I think you're on mute.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, I unmuted myself. I think it's an amazing insight into our Indian literature, and I could see the passion with which you delivered it. And I think it's the whole gamut of poetry in India has resonates, goes beyond borders and beyond time, and it was absolutely amazing. Children, you have any questions? Any teachers want to ask any questions? Please, you can check with Naresh ji. It was absolutely.
You could also disagree if you feel that I overinterpreted something or I got something wrong. I'm very happy to listen to your views, be it a student or a teacher. Yeah, I'm very happy, even if you have a violent.
Have your videos and keep your videos open, and then you can talk. Any questions? Anybody want to ask any question? Any of the the article students are here. Nagapatnam, Swarna ma'am. Yes, Swarna ma'am, you can introduce yourself.
Hariom ma'am.
Yeah.
Hariom sir, I'm Suvarna Dasarthi working in CIRS. It's very amazing to listen from you. It's very scholarly, sir. I enjoyed my college days, like where my Sanskrit teacher was teaching, and then it's nostalgic for me. Thank you. It's very scholarly, sir. I have a doubt. Generally, 7 kandas are there in Ramayana. Balakanda, Ayodhya then Naranyakanda, Kishkindakanda, Sundarakanda, Yuddhakanda, and then Uttarakanda. I heard in my childhood that Uttarakanda is not a part of the actual Ramayana. I was very curious when you told that I'll be dealing with the 3 things, like the oldest version of the Ramayana. I thought you will touch this. Is Uttarakanda written by Valmiki, or I heard in my childhood that it was written by Bhavabhuti, later it was credited to Valmiki. Is that true? Uttarakanda did really happen or not? Could you throw a little light on that? And then I have
Sure.
little more doubts also, sir. After a few, I'll ask.
You can give me all your questions. So I remember this question. You can tell me other questions as well, and I'll try and answer them one after the other.
Yes, sir. It's not a question, sir. It's an opinion. Second one is generally, I would like to correct me or to add some things in that. Generally, literature and language will flourish in a country when the country has the stability. Like due to this colonial period, we lost the legacy, and then people are away from their own language, and then this English is a cover for us now. Everything we want in English, then only children can understand, because it became a compulsory thing for the livelihood. So in this juncture, as you're working in a premium university, sir, uh, i- uh, how much part of this generation are really lenient towards this Sanskrit language, apart from one or two factors that now in Germany Sanskrit is in demand, there is a prosperous career for the translators. Apart from that factor, are the children serious in taking up this literature as their career or something? I would like to know from you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Both are great questions. I'll answer them in the sequence that you asked them. So for both, there's a short answer, which is somewhat simple, and then a long non-answer, which is a bit complex. So the short answer is the Uttarakanda is part of the Ramayana. Okay, and a text like the Ramayana, these are epic poems. While we ascribe them to a single person, that they have a single author, when we say Valmiki is the author of the Ramayana, now this sentence is not the same kind of sentence like I say, my parents own the house in which I live. Now, the fact that my parents own this house in which I live is documented. It has happened within living memory. There are two individuals that we can identify. They have Aadhaar card. There's some certificate that proves their names are on this piece of land. But here we are talking about a long poem which has many chapters that has survived through, for a long time, a tradition of being recited and remembered, and then also a long tradition of textualization where it was written down and so on. So Valmiki is a figure from a historical past, from long antiquity, isn't it? Which means that in the oral tradition, it's very likely that there are all of these nameless, faceless people who are also, they are also the authors of the Ramayana. They are also transmitters of the Ramayana. If you look at the Mahabharata, we kind of name Vyasa as kind of the nominal author of the Mahabharata. But in the frame story, who is constantly narrating it? It's this figure called Vaishampayana. Vaishampayana is narrating it to the king Janamejaya. So as we receive it, we are receiving not Vyasa's version of the Mahabharata, but Vaishampayana's version of the Mahabharata. So for any of these texts which are long durate texts that have endured over time, we have to think of them as coming through multiple hands, multiple authors. They are not closed texts, rather they are open texts. And it's possible that sometimes a bit has been added, at some. So there's a core of the Ramayana which is, say, 2,000 years old, and that there's some parts of the Ramayana that are 1,900 years old. And this is entirely possible. But I think the short answer is it was not Bhavabhuti who wrote the Uttarakanda. Bhavabhuti wrote a play in the 8th century based upon the topics that we find in the Uttarakanda called the Uttara Ramacharita. It's a great play. It'll make you cry. It is, the best example of one of these evening serials, which is full of melodrama, is Bhavabhuti. If he lived today, he would have been writing scripts for TV serials. He's a master of sorrow and melodrama and making you cry. Now, let's look at it this way. Writing in the 8th century, and Bhavabhuti did not belong to any political party. He was not interested either in praising Valmiki or criticizing Valmiki. If he took a story from the Uttarakanda and he wrote it into his play, what does it mean? It means by the 8th century, the Uttarakanda was well known, and the Uttarakanda was being used by somebody, maybe with a few modifications, to write a play which was about Rama. And again, this was not to support some party, to deny some party. Valmiki is not standing for election. Bhavabhuti is not standing for election. They are not spokesperson for any party. So just if we reflect upon this, and you can tell me what you think about this, ma'am. I feel that so already at a very early time, by the early medieval, even before the medieval period, the Uttarakanda was seen as part of the Ramayana. And for me, this answer is good enough. Did the events of the Uttarakanda really happen? So in the Uttarakanda, there's a description of how Ravana wants to find out about his ancestors. And he thinks he's very proud, that he's very big and he's very powerful. And then he asks his grandfather, and his grandfather sends him to Patala, and he says, you go to Patala, there is Mahabali, who's one of our ancestors. And he goes down there, and then he sees this giant round golden thing, and he's unable to lift it, and he doesn't understand what this thing is.
Will ask him to lift that. Yes.
Exactly. And then he realizes that this is a finger ring of Mahabali. And then Ravana is humbled, and he says, oh, this giant thing, it's somebody's finger ring. Then it means my ancestors, those Rakshasas, were much bigger and much more powerful. So now I can't answer questions like, did this really happen? So how many of the events in the Uttarakanda really happened? For me, that's a less interesting question. But what we know is that as part of the narrative tradition, it was already seen as part of Ramayana very early on. And I feel that's a good enough answer for us. I don't know. I don't know if we can get any closer than this. So now, because, Kalidasa narrates a certain version of the story of Shakuntala, where he's changed the events from the way it's described in the Jataka version of the Shakuntala story. He's changed it a bit from the way it's narrated in the Mahabharata. And this is the liberty of the poets. Remember, in the last slide, we saw that that goddess poetry is independent of the rules of the real world. So also poets are independent of the rules of previous poets. If Vyasa told the Shakuntala story or the Nala story a certain way, Kalidasa isn't obliged to say it the same way. If Valmiki said the story of Lava and Kusha and Sita and what happened to them in the forest in a certain way, Valmiki or whoever else, Bhavabhuti is not obliged to say it the same way. You can't change it drastically. You can't say that Lava and Kusha were Sita's parents. No, it has to be that Sita is Lava and Kusha's parents. The bare bones of the story have to be the same. But for aesthetic purposes, if the later poet wants to change something, unlike today, so today if you tried and wrote a play, I think, in which you change the theme of the story, people will take out dharna against you, they will declare war against you on Twitter and so on. But Bhavabhuti's times were kinder times. His poem survived, nobody burnt it, which is why we're able to read it today. So maybe there's a lesson about how we can keep our texts open, we can keep our minds open, either we can keep our hearts open, otherwise we'll need open heart surgery. Your second question. So I hope I gave you some kind of a non-answer to your question. Coming to your second question about, yes, all the languages, including Sanskrit, they're not so popular, they're not so important, they're not considered so important today. Also in my university, there's only a few students who come to read Sanskrit, not everybody. So first of all, let me disabuse you of any illusions you may have that being a translator is a very profitable career. I do translations from Sanskrit and it doesn't earn me any money. It's something that you do for pleasure, I think. And first of all, as in my first slide, I said, we're talking about the literatures of India, not just literature. The literature of India is not just Sanskrit literature. I believe that all of us should cultivate an interest to know about all the beautiful, amazing, mysterious things that are there in the stories, the poems, the literature, the riddles, and so on, in all of our languages. There's a Jain poet from the 17th century near Shimoga in Karnataka. He writes a grammar of Kannada. He writes a grammar of Kannada in Sanskrit called the Bhasha Bhushana. And then he begins it by saying, I pay my respects to that goddess who is Sarva Bhasha Saraswati. So it's not just Sanskrit who's Saraswati. Every language, the language of the Nicobar Islands, the language of Philippines, all of these, they are great languages. They all have very interesting literatures. But given our constraints of time, I think we can start with what is closer home. So if you're from Andhra Pradesh or Karnataka or Maharashtra, first learn the literatures of your language, learn to appreciate them before you start, judging things from elsewhere. Then read the great literature of the world. Read Homer, read the Gilgamesh, the great epic of Mesopotamia, stories of which you even find in the Harappan seal. So there's a Harappan seal of somebody strangling two tigers with each hand. And for a long time, people were trying to interview, is this an episode from Rig Veda? Is this from Shatapatha Brahmana? And we find out that this is an episode from the Gilgamesh, the great epic of Mesopotamia. So I think rather than have narrow senses of what our legacy is, you can have a broad sense of what our legacy. I think, we are legatees to all the literatures of the world, not just Kannada or Tamil or the pin code where we live or whatever our address is in our passport. And so I do believe that we don't need a reason for this. We don't need some fake paper that says NASA says Sanskrit is suitable for building rockets and all of that is false. We need to read interesting literature because I think it's interesting in its own merit. I don't have to make a case for it. I tried to make a case for it today. Well, we're in a situation where we need to make a case for it. But no, I can guarantee you reading Sanskrit is not going to make you smarter. It's not going to make more neuronal connections in your brain. You're not going to be more beautiful. Certainly, your hair won't grow longer. I am proof of that. But if you find interesting things in the languages and literatures of your part of the world, I think you should just read it to be a more sensitive, a more culturally literate person. Sorry, I went on and on. I'll stop with that. If there are any other
Anybody
questions
else
or
has any
comments
question?
from
Anybody
students or
else?
teachers, I'll be happy to.
There was a
discuss it with you.
Sunil from Bokaro who had raised his hand. Sunil ji.
Yeah, they probably left while I was going
Are you?
on.
No, I'm there. I'm there. Hariom Mama ji. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, you are
Yes.
audible.
Okay. Hariom Naresh ji.
Hello.
Yeah, Hariom sir. Now, don't you think that it is high time that NCERT must revise the syllabus of 11th and 12th and must include some Indian literature? Because ironically, we teach in India, but only 10% of the syllabus covers the Indian writers. So don't you think that it's time where students should, they should read more about the rich Indian literature, and it's high time to revise the syllabus?
Sure. Yeah. See, I have mixed feelings about this. Of course, I think it's a no-brainer. Let me start with what I agree with you about, and then I'll go to the part where I don't disagree, but I have a more qualified opinion. I agree with you on the point that not just students and somebody else, I think maybe Swarna madam or somebody spoke about future generations and about younger generations. And I think I've kind of, like we decode the codes of the Agananuru and Prakrit literature, I've also learned to decode our own language. And I feel sometimes when we speak about saving something for future generations, our anxieties are mostly about our own generation. When we say that, we need to preserve something for a later generation, we're talking about, hey, listen, this is something that I don't know anything about. My generation doesn't know anything about, and we would like to know about this. So I agree with you in that, yes, we should all have a better understanding, a better grasp of the rich literary traditions of India, both, the pre-modern traditions and also the very flourishing tradition of today. I think there's fantastic literature coming out, fiction and novels and travel writing in all the languages. I struggle to try and keep up with what interesting writers are doing today. But I also wonder if we believe that this is the business of the school alone, and this is the business of the NCERT alone. Should that be the only source from where our education happens? And if we don't have, because the text that I spoke about, the Gaha Satasai, is this amazing collection of verses from many, many poets over 200 or 300 years that was put together in the court of a certain king. There was a tradition of people who had savor for this poetry. They had a taste for this poetry. They remembered it. They wrote commentaries on it. They passed it on. And these poems circulated. So if there isn't this kind of groundswell of interest and love, by injecting something through the syllabus, I feel we'd rather make people allergic to it. So if I say, okay, I think Sanskrit literature is very important, we'll make it compulsory for all high schools all over India to study 40 hours of Sanskrit literature. By making it compulsory, I fear that I would drive away young people from being interested in it rather than wanting to read it. And I wonder if people can set examples by improving the reading culture at home. If we could just have books lying around, and this is, I know from the experience of myself and my friends, that finding books around at home and seeing people reading books and not just scrolling mindlessly on their phones all the time. We're all guilty of it. But if you see people spending some time reading books and discussing them at home, that really creates a culture of appreciating literature, of finding value in literature, and not just reading textbooks for passing entrance exams. I think we also need to do it from the other end, and maybe not expect the school, like, I'll send my children to school, and I have these wild beasts that are produced. I'll send them to your school. You convert them into polished, knowledgeable human beings and send them out. I think that's too much to expect of the school. The school's already doing a great job of it, but I suspect that
Nareshji,
we need to attack this.
can I
Yes,
add a point here, Nareshji?
yes,
Like
please. Yes,
what
of course.
Sunilji mentioned, I
Mhm.
think that is where the teacher's role is. I mean, like what Nareshji said, I totally, completely agree, endorse it, that there should be other, the other platforms for children to read or that thing. But I also feel there is a very important role that teachers play in this. While you are teaching English poetry, or while you are teaching Hindi poetry, or your Malayalam, or your even Tamil or Sanskrit or anything, you can always draw. If you are passionate about literature, you read other literatures, you'll see the scaffolding, kind of a support that you can give with other literature, examples, how the metaphors are used in some other literature, how the similes are used in poetry, what is the aesthetics in poetry appreciated in some other language. Also, if it can be supplemented in the classroom, whatever poetry you may be teaching, that I think will create interest in children. They'll start appreciating already, not just your own literature or the study they subject they study, but also they get to understand what is the ocean of the beauty of the how you can have the mystic beauty of poetry can be brought into the classroom. What do you say, sir? What do you think about it, Mr.
Yes, totally. I think, yes, we can all sneak it in, and there are great examples of people from other fields who are deeply interested in poetry. So there's the Italian scholar Primo Levi. I can't remember if he got a Nobel Prize, but he was a great chemist. He was an Italian Jew who lived through the Holocaust, and he's written this fantastic kind of biographical book called The Periodic Table, where he describes the life of his family, and each chapter it begins with a description of one of the elements that he worked with as a chemist. And I feel that, first of all, we can go beyond the silos of our disciplines, and we can learn to infuse literature and literary appreciation, and a sense of just of being appreciative, of being sensitive, of having a sense of humor in 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 all our topics. And I'm sure you all do it in your classrooms.
Chinmay Chakravarti wants to ask some question. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, Hari Om, sir. Hari Om, Amma.
Hari
I'm
Om.
from Arya Gurukul, Maharashtra. So, sir, I want to ask you one question, like just what Shanti Amma just said, that when we are doing even English poetry, bringing in comparison, drawing in comparison. So, since you had, you were reading verses from Kalidasa's Meghaduta. I want to ask you, sir, are poets like Shelley and even Khalil Gibran in their poems like Cloud and Song of Rain, were they inspired by Meghadutam? Because you find that similarity of a messenger, cloud as messenger, and the rain as messenger, and in Shelley's poem, the cloud as messenger, and quenching the thirst of, yeah, that is what I wanted to.
Yeah, it's entirely possible after the 19th century discovery of Kalidasa. There were translations quickly made into all the European languages. Though I wonder if I've never been to England, and I wonder if the experience of the rains in England can be anything like the monsoon that we experience in India, where you have two rounds of it. On the onset, you feel it one way, and then coming back, you feel it another way, and you have all of these festivals, and you have particular fruit and vegetables and dishes that you'll make. So I think the calendar that I've read some Javanese poetry, which is also very closely attuned to the seasons, and their monsoon is different. So the onset of the monsoon there is much later. So it begins in September, and what is the month of Kartika? It's called Kapat over there. That's when the monsoon begins, and then they have a duration of hot months, and then the real monsoons come. So while on the one hand, the use of rains and the use of weather in association with emotional situations may certainly be inspired. I think it's great to do this, to recognize parallels and to have comparative studies. But at the same time, there's also something very particular about the experience of the monsoon in the subcontinent, and we can see it in the particulars of the poems here. So in one place, Kalidasa speaks about how they were harvesting a certain rice crop, and I wonder, we don't do it so much now anymore, and it may also have to do with climate change and the precession of the calendar and so on. So there are going to be parallels, but I think we should then also pay attention to the particularities about how there are some things which are just not available to the experience of somebody in Europe. Their experience of the rains. It's not even the monsoon. You know, the word monsoon refers to these special. It's from an Arabic word which is mosam, and this is a phenomenon of this part of the world. And sure, there are rains everywhere. There's other poetry about the rains, and we should juxtapose these together, both to appreciate the similarities, but particularly to pay attention to what is unique about each set.
I
I
think
think
you have
it's a
done
great
quite a bit
idea.
of research about the place of the culture, where a lot of reference to the place, right, sir? You were mentioning.
I think it's really important that we, whether it's Shelley or it's Kalidasa, that we study them not as something suspended in midair, something that is born sui generis, but that we understand their cultural history, their geography, where they came from, what they were writing about, what inspired them. Otherwise, our reading of literature will be half blind.
Yeah.
We are just going
We
to be
have children wanting to ask questions from Amrita Vidyalayam.
okay. Great.
You can ask.
Excellent.
The children can come to the mic and ask.
Shreya, sir.
Yeah.
I'm Harshini of grade 11. We have a question. In the period of ancient times, we had many revolutionary wars, and of course, we had those descriptions in the ancient script. But we always remember Ramayana and Mahabharata as ancient stories most of the time. This is why those revolutionary and other stories are not familiar.
Okay. Yeah.
Not so
Thanks. That's a
popular.
great
Not so
question.
popular. Yeah.
Yeah. I think her name is Shreya. Very good question, Shreya. I don't really have a strong answer for this. It's first of all, I don't want to say it's a wrong question. I'm just saying that we cannot really gauge the popularity of one story versus the other. And you're right in that there are many stories which are about battles. Like in Tamil Nadu, there's this famous poem which, if you like gruesome, horrible things like me, you'll appreciate, the Kalingathu Parani. So the Parani is a war poem. And it describes some war where there's all kinds of rakshasas and pishachas. They're coming and drinking the blood from these corpses and eating the intestines that come out of them. And then there are these heads have been chopped off, and then those torsos are still able to walk around like zombies. And there is, there are poems of this kind which are descriptions of the battlefield, not so much with the historical details, but just descriptions of the goings on of war. And in the respective areas, they're very popular. And I think from recent history, like in the early modern period, you have particular stories of war. Like in Andhra, you have this Bobili Raja Katha, Bobili Yuddha Katha, Katamaraju Katha, and these local stories about what for them was an important and significant war. Similarly, in Karnataka, you have the stories of Kumararama, the battles of Kumararama. There's songs that memorialize the battles that Tipu Sultan fought, and depending on where it is told, he's either made into a hero or he's described as a villain. But I would just hasten to tell you that the core of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are not really the battles. Maybe in the case of the Mahabharata, we tend to thematize or pay more attention to the battle itself. But these are complex stories, and it's not even a single story. We have to see them as these clusters or constellations of many, many different stories that are all enmeshed into each other. So I wonder if the most memorable part of these stories are their battles. And so if there's some kind of popularity contests again about the stories of various battles, and if these are the most popular battles. And I think there are other reasons for why these stories are popular. I think the epics are popular not because they are stories about people who did the right thing all the time, but because they are stories that help us to think through our own ethical dilemmas. So the story of Ramayana is not to tell you that Rama did the right thing all the time, he made the correct decision all the time. The story of Mahabharata, for example, the Mahabharata is also to tell us about all the wrong decisions that people made. If Yudhishthira did certain things wrong, if Bhishma did certain things wrong, if people had a flawed understanding of dharma. And why do we have a combination of stories of people that perhaps made good and bad decisions? Is not to tell us that, hey, be like this person, don't be like that person. No, these are not prescriptions. And again, this is my view about how we should treat classical literature, in that it gives us a kind of a laboratory, a workspace to think through our own concerns, our own moral, ethical, otherwise concerns about what should I do in a certain situation I'm undergoing. We can either go talk to a friend, and our friend is limited just like us, they live in our times. So instead, it's possible sometimes that we can use these narratives, we can use the moral dilemmas that people undergo in these narratives, not as a lesson, but as a space to think about, so does this help me to think about my own problems? So if Nala played a game of dice, lost his kingdom, and he and his wife had to go to the forest, and then he abandoned his wife as well, and he went somewhere else, he got bitten by a snake. None of this is a prescription. Nobody's telling you, play a game of dice, go to the forest, get bitten by a snake. Rather, we can use these episodes to think about, so what did people do in those situations? And then, does this help me to think about my own situation? And I feel this is a more useful way, a more helpful way to think about these stories that are actually alien to us. They are separated from us in space and time. They're so different from the world of experience. But still, when it comes to matters like moral dilemmas, like emotional experiences, there's still continuities. There's still a universal quality that makes sense to us. At least that's my view.
Thank you. You have any other questions? Anybody else has? Can we wind up?
Yes, if not, let's wind up. I'm tired. I'm not used to speaking for so long.
It was amazing.
Thank
It was
you.
absolutely
Thank you.
amazing that you could give time, and these children are really fortunate, to get an expert like you address them, and its education cell is extremely thankful to you, sir. Anybody would like to give a word of thanks to sir? Any of the students? Attakal, Nagapatnam, Kannur, children are sitting here, would like to speak. Anybody would like to speak? Yeah.
On behalf of all KTPI students, especially Chinmaya Vidyalaya, I extend my heartfelt gratitude for the resource person of the day, Sri Naresh Keerthi sir, for gracing us with your invaluable insights and expertise during the illuminating online section on Indian literature. We are immensely grateful for your dedication, time, and efforts in making the session an intellectually stimulating and enriching experience for all participants. Once again, thank you for sharing your experience. We are also grateful to Dr. Shanti Krishnamurthy, ma'am, Director of CCMG, for organizing the session. We sincerely hope for future opportunities to continue learning from such sessions. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you. Anybody else? Any teacher would want to give a word of thanks?
Om Namah Shivaya, ma'am.
Yeah, Om Namah Shivaya.
We are the students of Amrita Vidyalayam Nagapattinam. Today we feel fortunate to have this session on the topic Indian literature. We are feeling immense pleasure and enthusiasm throughout the session and learned wide knowledge of Indian literature as we went through the literatures like Ramayana, Gada Saptati, Meghaduta. All of these demonstrated our Indian culture and its significance along with its morality. Thank you, sir, for this wonderful session. And thank you, Shanti ma'am, for providing or organizing this KTPI workshop.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really amazing to, I think the first time you're having a children listening to your talks along with teachers and all of that. We are trying to, CBSE has introduced it with a lot of very ambitious project is this KTPI subject in 11 and 12. And Chinmaya Mission is trying to promote the subject. If you see overall in India, not more than 100 children are taking the subject right now. So we are trying to promote it, and even our own Vidyalayas, more and more children are getting into the subject because it gives a beautiful exposure to our own Indian system, knowledge system. That's just, I think, and you have been contributed it so well, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thank you once again, Naresh ji. It was a pleasure having you here. Thank you so much.